While humanity had to deal with the great cataclysm of losing its moons, also known as the time of judgment or Judgment Day itself, on the planet of Menar, two different sentient species that share a homeworld had to face the wrath of their own planet. They, in particular, had two separate moons stuck in synchronous orbit, never eclipsing each other. It was as though the moons itself stayed clear of each other, keeping on the opposite sides of the planet. The dual moons, when pulled away from the planet, caused the planet to try and kill everyone. Prior to losing the moons, they received a distress call, and all the main forces broke away to assist a species that apparently was dealing with this. After the fleet, consisting mostly of several dozen corvettes and frigates, left their own planet basically defenseless, one planetary rotation, the moons began to move. They began to pull apart on opposite directions, and the gravitational fields that were being pulled in separate sides began to rip the outer atmosphere apart. It was twice as bad as what Earth went through, as half of the planet wasn't actually being affected at the same time. In this case, there was absolutely no hiding. The sudden disturbance in the atmosphere made everything grounded. Sending any ships to investigate what the hell happened, why the moons had started to just leave and simultaneously in opposite directions, was near impossible. Even if they could get off the ground, getting all the way outside the atmosphere was just not going to happen. By the time they would even reach there, it would have been too late anyway, and the moons would have gone rogue, meaning that risking your own life would have been pointless to that point. Inside the atmosphere, the storms intensified to a point that no one understood, and they changed to patterns so erratic that no computer model ever created could have possibly figured out what the hell was going to happen next. Many ships did return to try and evacuate folks off the planet, yet they found out very quickly that as soon as they landed, if they landed and didn't end up going to the surface with a very loud thump, they were unable to take off again. Many of the ships were simply pulled off of their own landing pads and tossed around like tumbleweeds, crashing into the forest and turning into nothing but slag on the ground. Storm cells began to form so erratically around them that one ship was seen lifting off of the pad, being tossed in one direction. 2 seconds later, it was flying back the opposite direction. Then it flew back again towards its original direction, then towards the building where it smashed in, then having a gust raise it high up in the air and then turn it into some sort of twister, which is not native to the planet. And then everyone inside, hoping that this was just the most interesting ride they're ever going to get, didn't feel anything else, as suddenly a downburst phenomenon crashed them into the ground at over Mach 1. Those who tried to take shelter were looking at their own readouts and couldn't figure out what was going on. Their sensors would suddenly read 1800 millibars, which is as far as it could read, and then it would bury the needle. They knew it was higher, and then it would suddenly drop within moments down to 950 millibars, and this was in seconds. If they were lucky, it was minutes, but either way, the sudden change in pressure made everything unbelievably painful to their sensitive lobes, and it made it so most of them could not focus. Not only could not focus on anything that was going on, they couldn't focus enough just to get up and walk. Everything was blurry, everything was dizzy, and everything was coming across. Then suddenly the lightning began to show up, crashing so hard and so fast that anything that was in the air anymore was struck down. Anything that was flammable, to include anything with feathers, suddenly burst into flames and was simply ripped apart by the air. The lightning would also strike anything warm and moving on the ground, so anyone desperately trying to reach cover didn't make it. Anyone surviving this had to deal with thunder that was so strong that was able to burst glass, and of course anything made out of porcelain, as it sent in shockwaves through the entire building. Many of the canine-type residents hid inside their homes, instinctively climbing into their bathing pools, and they would sit and shake in fear, waiting and hoping for it all to end as everything crashed around them. Items crashed into their buildings, the sound of thunder ripped through, and they could feel the tingle of the lightning as it struck all around them. The homes, many of which were torn asunder by the massive amount of wind and the floods that came after. Floods forced many into the streets, desperately trying to paddle away as best they could. All around the cities, those that could not stay inside due to the rising water climbed onto their roofs and hoped that the building would hold, but also stayed as low as they could, hoping that the lightning would not find them. Unfortunately, for many, the lightning did. And if they were very unlucky, they stayed alive just enough that the water swept them away. Sudden changes in temperature were also causing everyone to go from heat stroke to hypothermia within sometimes less than a minute. Being covered in fur did not help them at all. Once the fur got wet, as soon as it got cold, they would freeze, and then they would suddenly feel the heat, and it would all steam away, making the air almost unbreathable, very, very, very thick. And as they panted away, trying to get the heat away, suddenly they would get a gasp of cold air again that would send a chill down their spine, all the way to all their paws. All sea level areas would eventually feel the wrath of tsunamis as long dormant volcanoes burst open underneath their oceans. Tectonic shifts cause even more issues as some of the shelves drop or raise well over 100 meters. This caused all sorts of havoc as the tsunamis would sometimes crash into each other and then ricochet and then go back towards the shore they just left. Underwater volcanoes and earthquakes were sure they were horrible to make everything by the shoreline bad, but above ground, massive rock slides from the high mountains of the planets became a major issue. The soaked ground from all the rain that came down and with the shaking caused massive mud floods to cover entire towns. Once sprawling villages were now gone, completely covered, entombed for all eternity. On more than one occasion, the only thing that was still up in the air that you could see that was manufactured was a single building, one of their worship areas that was raised higher than others, usually on top of a hill, and just the very peak stuck out, a marker for those that will no longer rise. On the other side of the planet, the feline race began to climb up towards the top of anything they could with the first arrival of water, as they weren't not fans of the water itself. They could swim, of course, but their species just did not enjoy it. They ran to find anything they could climb, and mainly found their way up trees, and simply had to sit there and wait and hope that the water would not sweep them away. Unfortunately, the lightning would find them as they scurried up the tree itself, or hitting the tree being the highest point available. Whenever the lightning struck, this species in particular would be paralyzed, if only for a few moments, up to about a minute. But once they were paralyzed inside the buildings, they could only sit there and watch as their brains still functioned as the water got closer and closer. If they were on the roof, climbing up the side of a building, or, Lord help them, in a tree, the strike would make them lose all ability to hold on, retracting their claws, and they could do nothing but feel themselves fall away from their sanctuary and into the rushing waters below. Both species had to feel the full wrath of the volcanoes, quakes, and tsunamis, things they are not ever prepared for, as their entire planet was very seismically stable. But with the loss of both moons at the same time, there wasn't anything to stop it from becoming active once again. Realizing that this was going on, the felines could only get to the highest point they could. Many of them, once there, too afraid to move, hardly afraid to breathe, and more often not messing themselves out of sheer fear. They feared that if they fell into the raging water or the molten magma that went by, they may be taken away very, very quickly and painfully. The worst case scenario happened to many of them as the pressure was too much for the buildings or the trees they were on or whatever they climbed up, and down they would go, screaming the entire way, realizing that this was the last sound they were going to make. The largest issue was the rise of a new continent on the side of the planet, raised right up from the ocean floor several hundred meters, and sinking of one of the old continents. This did not help, as the sinking continent took a good 15 to 16% of their population down to the ocean floor with them. After everything settled, both species pulled together as best they could. Due to such losses, they had no choice but to pool their resources and try to simply survive. They looked and they realized that their food was pretty much gone. Most of the ranches that they raised their food on were completely decimated. Infrastructure was unusable at best or non-existent at worst. The only bonus was the massive, and I do mean massive, amount of fish left on the surface as the waters receded. It seemed as though the mix of mud and clay and everything else mixed in with the water made it so the fish didn't realize that the waters were receding and they were just everywhere, and everyone could feast as they cried for the loss of their loved ones. Pretty soon, they all had to go back to primitive survival techniques. This was due to their infrastructure being completely and totally decimated, and it would take time. But for right now, creature comforts were not on the list, but only survival. They ate what they could and immediately began to preserve everything else. Their greatest asset, to everyone's surprise, was the elders. These were heralded as masters to everyone, as due to their almost long-forgotten knowledge, they were able to remember how to preserve things to make sure that everyone stayed alive, everyone stayed fed, and the survivors could, in fact, survive. You couldn't just read it from a book, which was a good start, of course, but, as the elders would say, it's always the little things. The little things that will either keep you alive or kill you. It's good to know the little things. For a time, for a very short time, it seems as though they would be able to survive and rebuild without any problems. Though having to survive without the creature comforts is going to be difficult, but at least they wouldn't have to go feral to make sure they did survive. Then the planet itself got sick. Nearly simultaneously, 3 Earth weeks after the storms had receded, all females got ill, and not just the sentient species. All fauna seemed to get violently ill. It didn't matter if they were mammalian, insectoid, it did not matter. Every single female across the entire planet was getting very, very sick, and no one knew why. Due to the infrastructure loss, they couldn't even find out what the hell was going on, what was happening to them. They simply had to try and comfort them as best they could. However, everything they did was in vain, as the females began to die in some of the most violent ways they saw. Tempers absolutely flared. Many thrashed out at the few doctors remaining. Some of them raged at each other. Some tried to blame the other sentient species, but they could see that everyone was being affected. It was absolute chaos at that point, as they had nothing left to use. What were they going to do? They now were in despair. But hope was not all lost. As before, a few females that remained were immediately fought over, of course, but this held everyone's hope. In some cases, these females were used as bargaining chips for supplies, or simply fought over where even more of their population would die, just trying desperately to make sure that their bloodline would survive. Even after the females are secured and there is no more fighting, the realization sets in. With almost no females, how the hell do they breed their food? hunting is already very difficult, as most of the prey had been killed off. But now the prey numbers have been cut in half, and that's of the remaining that's there. What's even worse is they checked to see what was going on with the insects, and it turned out that insects, in some cases, had 100% loss in their own females. They weren't ever going to produce again. What in the hell were they going to do without their pollinators? If plants didn't germinate, they would start to go extinct. And they did. It took a long time, a very long time, before the food supplies began to run so low that a simple sack of edible tubers is worth more in their currency than any precious metal they have on the entire planet. Eventually, it got so bad, they resorted to eating the corpses of what remained. If anyone fell, they were immediately grabbed a hold of, the body stripped of any clothing it may have, even though they usually don't wear any, and butchered right there. If desperate enough, they would simply start tearing apart the body, even as the heart was just starting to end its beats. Some banded together to hunt, but they did not hunt the prey, as there wasn't much left. They hunted each other. This left nothing behind, even bodies, as once one was taken down, even the blood was licked off the road to make sure they got all the nutrients. This desperation cannot be understated, as this was the only way that they survived. There was, however, a single creature that was slightly mutated by the disease that was released. It was a very vicious varmint that became an indeterminate grower, and now it ruled the land. Originally, the way it moved, it basically sauntered across the area, just not really caring. It was always dangerous to deal with, and usually took several to take it down, as just shooting it usually wasn't enough. Its skin was so thick that a lot of times their own weapons would not penetrate. Even if they poisoned it, it would simply take a break, take a nap, and then roll over and then attack you again. It was just a difficult creature to take down. And now the longer it lived, the bigger it got. After all the floods and all the disease, originally they thought, well, this creature is in abundance and they could actually use it as prey, and many did. But soon enough, after several years, a couple decades perhaps, many of them got so big that this prey was now a predator. This went on for many, many years. So many years that the entire population just stopped counting. They didn't seem to care. If you survived at the end of the day, it was considered a good omen. Yet there was one day they will not ever forget. Many of them started yelling and screaming to their own brethren, pointing out into the distance, and they could see unfamiliar craft landing way off in the distance. They believed, all of them believed, that the others, those that had done this to them, forced them to watch their own family members die, their own kin. Well, they had finally come. They'd finally come to finish the locals off. A mixed group of canine and feline hid in fear. With their backs to the wall, they believed that this was going to be the end, and if they're cornered, like any beast, they would lash out, and they would destroy any who come in close, and they would make sure that any victory tastes as bitter as utter defeat. They still had what little bit of themselves intact, and they were not ever going to let anyone take that from them. When a group of bipeds walked down the street, a group of these felines and canines watched them from the shadows, making sure not to be seen. Every time they thought one of these bipeds were turning to look at them, they would duck down away, making the bipeds pause for a second, thinking there's movement, perhaps. But when they went to check, nothing would be there. They watched the group of bipeds move from house to house. It looked as though they were searching, many of them carrying very massive weapons, and soon they saw that these bipeds were very, very large, easily 3, 4, sometimes 5 times larger than they are, yet they seem to move with a deliberate grace as wide as they are. They also seemed to be insectoid, with some sort of carapace over them. Or what was that? They didn't know. They didn't know what they were looking at because they couldn't see a face. But this wasn't time to worry about that. They only knew one thing. They knew that these creatures were coming in, and their search was beyond thorough. They believed that any military would come in and just search a few buildings, and if they saw one piece of movement, they would end up just destroying the entire area. The locals had to play this as smart as possible. But as these bipeds got closer, there was less places to hide. They wouldn't be able to keep themselves hidden for very long. Plus, they had to be able to move the females, and the few young that were there. How are they going to do this? How are they possibly going to get them out there before they're destroyed? There's only one option. And out of fear for their own species, and sheer hunger at this point, as they for some reason could smell fresh meat, many of them drooled at the idea of at least getting a mouthful of these bipeds before they die, filling their stomach with their own flesh. Maybe, for once, they would have a meal that wasn't rotted, wasn't so lean that it was killing them. With a single look, several of them jumped out from behind the buildings and out the windows and attacked the humans below them. They tried to bite and claw their way into the humans, using their emaciated bodies to knock the humans down with simple weight as they landed on top of the shoulders, the heads. And they didn't realize, though, that humans wear exosuits. The teeth and claws just would not penetrate. Even thrashing around once they got them inside their jowls didn't work, and many times the locals were simply tossed to the ground as though they were nothing. One of the young male canines gripped the platoon leader's arm after hearing it say something as it seemed to talk into its arm over the comms. It grabbed a hold and thrashed as hard as it could. A younger feline saw this and landed right on the head of the LT, trying to tear at its helmet with his claws front and back, doing everything they could to try and take this thing down. The LT simply whipped his arm and swatted the canine into the ground, then reached up with his other hand, grabbed the feline, and threw him right next to the canine, hearing both of them thud against the ground as they landed, both of them landing with enough force that when they hit, they didn't want to get back up. The LT looked at them and paused for a moment, seeing the absolute craziness was going on around them, and then announced through his speakers of his exosuit a translated message. "We are the humans of the Sol system. We did not come to fight. We came to aid you." This made both local species stop dead at what they're doing, and they simply looked at the bipeds in those exosuits that obviously were not attacking. They just simply stood there. Then they looked up at these massive bipeds, and they then looked at each other and asked, "What should we do with these things? Are they really here?" One of the humans said in a suit-to-suit transmission, "Man, they look like Holocaust victims. Holy shit." The platoon sergeant immediately snapped in and said, "Give some of your food to them. Now." As they all reached in and grabbed the very, very dense bars that they eat, the medic immediately chimed in, "Just a little at a time. Oh, just a little. Just piece it off. Just a little at a time." Everyone paused for a second and looked, and he continued, "Too much at once and you're gonna kill them. Okay? They will eat, right now, the way they are, they will eat everything until their stomach explodes. I'm not even joking. They will not know what it is to be full. Little bits. Hand little bits to each one of them. With that, everyone simply nodded their heads and kept going. Everyone, once they pulled out the ration bars, began to break them off small pieces one by one and started handing them out to each of the locals. One ration bar is able to cover 3 days for a human, so it's definitely far too rich for a species that's only half or a quarter the size of any human being. They tried to slow the locals down from eating until they absolutely passed out and died, but that was difficult at best, as once the locals realized there was additional food, they began to lunge at the pouches that the foods were kept in. It didn't matter what the humans said, trying to tell them that if they ate too much, they're gonna die. They were so hungry, it didn't matter. It seemed as though they had been on starvation rations their entire lives. Many of them looked like they suffered from mange due to malnutrition. It was absolutely horrible. That was when a few of the others simply grabbed the human by the hand and motioned and kept saying, "This way, this way, this way, come this way, come this way." One of the young riflemen followed them, and they went over to where the females were. The females were very adequately protected, as those that were around them held the few weapons that were still actually able to work. Once inside, the humans saw what was going on. And of course, the locals were waving at their brethren, "Don't shoot, don't shoot. He's a friend, he's a friend, he's a friend." With that, the rifleman simply put his weapon down, kneeled down as low as he could, pulled out the last of his rations, and said once again to them, "Feed them slowly. Unless you want to watch them die, feed them slowly. Do you understand? Tell me you understand." They all acknowledged, and he pulled out the bar and crushed it in his hands, making sure that it was all small pieces, and then held it out as though he was giving an offering at church. They all ran up, and he once again yelled slowly at them. They all worried because this came out as angry. They then grabbed the pieces, not only had some for themselves, but brought them over to the females. The females looked even worse than the males did, as they were not allowed to move around any. The young ones, some still even nursing, were able to eat just a little bit better that day. Calls around the planet were immediately active. Calls for food, and a lot of it, along with water purification as well. Anything they needed to get these critters up and running again. Also, there was a call for engineers and medics to arrive at earliest convenience, but that one was definitely put with a little bit of sarcasm. It was a nice way of saying, "Get your ass down here." As humans aided everybody, what looked like amorphized cats and dogs, they received a little bit of information about what happened. As they condensed what they could find, there really wasn't anything they didn't already know. The only thing that was of interest by the 30-pound brain folks who work in Intel was some strange intermittent sensor shadows that were around the moons as they went outside their own orbit. This was strange, but nothing they could pin anything else on. The recovery efforts around the world allowed it so that the locals were far less hostile. This would allow the locals of Menbart to finally look on the faces of their saviors. They looked strange to Menbart, not having a lot of fur on their faces. Many of them would make sure they didn't actually grow any on their face anymore due to a funky laser. Showing the bare skin on the face made a few of the locals actually cringe in almost disgust. But then again, these are aliens after all. They let that slide. Although a few of the humans kept making the mistake of showing their teeth and made all the locals look at them as though they were going to attack, many of the humans simply would put their hand up and cover their mouth, realizing the mistake. But it's not as though the locals would do anything, because something gave away their true intention. It was the eye. The locals would constantly say how there was a bit of pain behind it. They care. They definitely care, but there was pain behind it. Pain that they were not showing to anyone else, nor did they talk about it. Though the eyes of the humans changed as the local predatory species seemed to approach and then attacked a population. The humans attached to them picked up anything they had close. If they couldn't reach their rifles, they picked up anything from sticks and blades and what have you. And they battled the horde of predators that came in thinking this was going to be a feast. The humans do tower over these creatures that seem to not actually give a fuck that they're being faced off against something a whole lot bigger. The humans seem to line up, say something, and then laugh, commenting on the yellow stripes that go down this creature's back. They then go to battle with these predators, swinging hard, cracking them right across the face with anything hard they can find, sometimes a metal rod, sometimes a full-on rock. Whenever the creatures jump, they always use the exosuit to try and block them to make sure that they don't lose a piece, but sometimes these creatures are able to actually bite through one of the softer parts of the armor. The humans didn't back down as the locals tried to scramble inside to try and hide. They watched in amazement as the humans faced off. And even as one of these predators, the size of a human itself, showed itself by charging towards the line, the humans did not hesitate to pull their sharp pieces of metal from their sides and out of their armor and face such a creature, such a devastating monster. And they simply drove straight into it. Forget this thing not giving a fuck. The humans don't seem to give a fuck. After dispatching many of these large predators, to include the monster itself, the humans returned to the line and to the locals. They were bloody, beaten, but they were laughing at the entire battle. They seemed to find it absurd that they had to face something like that. One of the younger males walked up and said, "How? Why? What? Where did you learn to fight something like that? That was a practice. That, what? I don't understand." One of the humans simply took a knee and kneeled down as the blood dripped off his arm. "Oh, we have something like that on our own planet. Not something you ever want to face, especially one-on-one, unless you have the same mentality they do." What type of creature? And what type of mentality? They all chuckled for a moment before answering. "Oh, it's a honey badger, and honey badger don't give a fuck." And you know why we respect something like that? We respect it so much for being able to face something, no matter the odd, that I don't know if you noticed this. He pointed over to a strange badge on his shoulder. This was a unit patch, and on it was something that nobody had seemed to recognize until now. They saw that the strange stitching was the same side view of that same predator. This is our unit, Honey Badger. With that, the locals no longer questioned how humanity was able to fight like it was and how they could survive for so long and do so well after facing the same hardships. Approximately 2 months later, the locals are finally set up to survive and thrive without human assistance, although they were given several pieces of human equipment to include a lot of 410 shotguns to make sure they could face off against their predator. But they wouldn't need it, hopefully, for a very long time. But you never know. The humans got ready to leave because this wasn't their home, nor was it their mission. And they were going to find out what in the hell happened. When asked by one of the honored elders, one of the humans said, "There are other species that are not answering. We will be assisting them too." One of the felines looked up and put their paw on the side of the human's leg and said, "You are our angels." The human seemed to smile but tried to hide his teeth and said, "Yeah, angels with shotguns." With that, they all left the planet, and after leaving Minbar, humanity's expedition force moved to the next closest system. For all their advanced tech, the Greys have been completely silent. Entering their system, humanity broadcast their arrival. No response. At all. Nothing. The Greys had 3 planets colonized in their home system, but no response. They sent out a large data pulse. No response. As they moved closer, humanity's fleet began scanning the system. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. A planet was missing. You see, in this sector, there was actually 2 planets that were considered colonized plus the homeworld. One of these planets was now in the same orbit as an asteroid field. This was odd, and nobody knew what was going on. They got closer and checked their data, and many started saying, no, it can't, no, fuck! Everybody was confused at this and asked why the outburst. As it turned out, the Greys' home planet is now a footnote in history. The other 2 worlds are also now covered in impact craters. They didn't know what the hell was going on, but the force itself was split into 2 and head in different directions to the 2 remaining planets. They kept broadcasting and asking permission to land, but no one ever responded. Eventually, they had to force a landing just like they did on the previous world. When those that left the shuttles walked out, they found 2 things. The double D, destruction and death. There was bodies strewn everywhere, many of them half decomposed from all this time. It was clear that most of them didn't die from impacts, though. You would think with all the debris that came from a planet basically exploding, crashing into these colony worlds, but no. It was clear that they did not die from blunt force trauma, as their bones were still intact. They had to pull blood samples to find out what was going on. Even though there was very little in the way of soft tissue remaining, they were able to get what they needed. And the blood samples were analyzed very closely. And as it turned out, the manufactured disease had killed all of them. It seemed as though they didn't die the same violent way. It seemed as though their brains had somehow leaked into itself, and they died that way. Not via a stroke, per se, as their bodies are set up very different than most. But still, most of them were probably extremely confused, delusional, and probably higher than a kite, as their hearts just quit when their brains filled with fluid. While these results were being triple, quadruple, and quintuple checked just to make sure that they had everything right, they worried about one of the groups on the 4th planet. One of the pieces from the asteroid field fell down and was beginning to head straight towards the planet itself. They wondered if it was going to burn up in the atmosphere, which much of it did, yet it still was going to collide with the planet, and we had friendlies down there. As the rock crashed into the planet, shaking everything around it, those in the command area yelled for a status to find out what was going on. They immediately turned over to the video that was coming in to see what was going on. The ceremonial bowls that were set up on the bridge, most of which were a funeral type deal for that species, began to fall down all around the squad as they had taken cover near the bridge. The response was, "It's raining buckets, sir, but not much else." As they searched, it turned out that the disease had jumped to everything. And I do mean everything. The Greys had seemed to try and battle the illness, as they came across an entire continent's worth of Greys that just didn't seem to be broken down. They took another sample and checked to see what was going on, but it seems as though whatever they had done to try and stop a viral or bacterial outbreak just allowed the fungal part to get stronger. A lot stronger. and it also forced everything to mutate and jumped all the species barrier, and nothing above bacteria survived. And of course, some fungus as it was on the walls. Then the fungus did something very, very interesting. It began to sprout, popping out, making a very strange pop and hiss sound, and then it reanimated the not so decomposing bodies, and then jumped up to attack the exosuits. Though it tried, most of the bodily functions were not working right, so they simply staggered. Most of them fell several times on the way. Realizing the danger, the command came out, "Kill him! Kill it with fire!" With that, every single exosuit began to open up its own flamethrower and begin to douse every single body in the area. They could hear all sorts of squealing and yelling as the fungus itself cooked right there. Anyone else heading down to the planet was given even more accelerants, as they only had about a minute's worth of burn time in a standard suit. This allowed them to keep going and searching for anyone, searching for anything that might be around. Just as before, they left no door unturned, no rock unflipped. They checked everywhere, but there was nothing. No survivors. They looked at the homeworld of the Greys, and it turned out that it was destroyed by two separate rogue moons, one from each of its planets on either side. Somehow, it had got almost a time on target and had crushed the homeworld. It had actually accordioned it, squeezing it right in the middle, forcing it to burst like a zit. Everyone believed that was a rough way to go, because there's no way that that could happen without everybody realizing it was about to. The gravitational shift alone from a moon-sized object heading towards your planet would definitely be enough to get your attention. Although, given the size of these pieces, this was a very slow process, at least by anyone's standards on the ground. It would take several days before it went from the outside of the atmosphere all the way to the surface. But once it did, it was traveling at speeds so fast that, well, squish is all you could really say. As horrible as this was, there was also something else that was not right. Examining the remnants of the Greys' mighty space navy, at least what was left of it, it was clear to anybody that had lived more than 10 minutes that someone actually helped the remaining forces to die. There was absolutely clear battle damage on most of the ships still adrift in the sector. Seeing this, each ship was searched very, very carefully and approached very carefully as they looked for survivors. Anything, anyone, something. They needed answers. They needed anything at this point. As they searched through the vessels, they found a grand total of 31 stasis pods with viable personnel inside. However, these would have to be immediately transferred to a frigate and sent back towards Earth, as it was far too unsafe to open them aboard ship. Just in case of other complications, they needed all the assets available to make sure they didn't kill off an entire species. As they continued to look into the ship's logs, it revealed nothing. The Greys had been very, very thorough, as they had completely destroyed, scrambled, erased, or in other way, shape, or form ended their drives. After this exhausting search on the planets, and also in space, there wasn't anything left to do. So, on to the next species. Everybody knew who it was going to be. This amphibious species, basically, if you stood them up, a 4-foot tall green and brown quadrupedal frog, a species that was very unpleasant to look at, usually was very nice in the manners, but you always wanted to keep your helmet on because, well, honestly, they stink. They have no sense of smell. So everything on their planet smells like rotten sewage that's wrapped up in, well, think of anything that's disgusting, and there you go. As the exploration group moves on, they wonder if there going to be denied everything as they go through space, to include their revenge at what happened to Earth. Perhaps it was the amphibians. Maybe. Maybe if it was, then the humans are really going to be ready to croak some toads. So far, they think about it, that's two species that were slowly being brought back from the brink, and another species nearly annihilated their survivors in pods right now. Many joke that the felines would have survived after all having 9 lives, although that's not too much of a joke, as they actually do have 9 molting cycles, and when they molt, this species actually does get younger. Basically, it's like if a human got all the way to 80 or 90 years old and then shed the outer half of their body, and inside was a basically teenage version of themselves that just had to finish growing up. It was impressive, if not disturbing to watch. The canine species didn't have that, as they actually just had exceptionally long lifespans. Damn near a millennium if you just fed them and made sure they didn't get sick. Of course, knowing this of the two species that were still out there, the joke about, hey, be careful, because how much is that doggy in the window? Well, they might bark and jump at you and rip off your arm if you're not careful. Dark humor is pretty much the only thing that kept them all going, especially since they might end another species on the next jump. If they were in fact the root cause of what happened, everybody was still angry, and that anger had never subsided over the past several hundred years. Everyone smiled at the idea that they might actually get a little bit of blood that patched that giant hole left in their hearts by the loss of their loved ones when they heard the sound, General Quarters, all hands, General Quarters. Hello everybody, this is Syntax. Thank you so much for joining me on part 3 of this long form story. Before I go, I need to send out some special thank yous to a few of my supporters, and those will be SS Demon, Erica Gem, MTF Guard, Guardian Sage, and Brian Kemp. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Everyone else, I will see you on the next one. This is Syntax, ejecting.